The neighborhood of Villa Esperanza had always been a place of contrasts. On one hand, tree-lined streets and modest houses where longtime residents had known each other for decades. On the other, a constant and often intimidating police presence, a result of a history of prejudice against the predominantly black community. Miguel Andrade, 55, a retired university professor and renowned writer, was one of the most respected residents there. Known for activism in social causes and critical literature on inequality and racism, Miguel never stayed silent in the face of injustice. A black man with a firm voice, graying hair, and a piercing gaze, he was a role model for the neighborhood's youth. In recent months, Miguel had been invited by an NGO to coordinate a social project focused on inclusion and critical education for vulnerable teenagers. The project used spaces in the Carolina de Jesus Community Library, one of the few cultural refuges in the area. Despite the project's positive impact, police presence in the area intensified. Young participants were violently stopped, searched without cause, and often labeled as suspects. Miguel tried to engage local authorities, but his appeals were ignored. One day, arriving for another session of the project, Miguel found a group of frightened teenagers outside the library. Two officers were questioning one of the boys, Renan, 15, a shy and talented writer. "What are you doing here?" asked one officer, his voice dripping with suspicion. "I'm just going to writing class. I didn't do anything," replied Renan, his voice trembling. Miguel quickly stepped in to intervene. "Officers, this boy is part of our educational project. There's no reason for this approach." The taller officer looked Miguel up and down with a cynical smirk. "Oh, you're the professor? Funny, you look more like one of the neighborhood's idlers than a teacher." Miguel felt his blood boil but held back. He knew any word could be used against him or Renan. After minutes of tension, the officers walked away, but not without a final contemptuous glance. The incident left Miguel unsettled. The public safety system meant to protect the community was the same, one terrorizing it. That encounter wasn't isolated, it was part of a pattern of systemic abuse and racism. Miguel began documenting the accounts of the targeted youth, their fears and struggles. He spoke with other teachers and local activists, trying to grasp the full scope of the problem. The idea of a dossier on police abuse began to take shape, but little did he know that his pursuit of justice would thrust him into an even greater confrontation, threatening not only his project but his own safety. After the incident at the library, Miguel dedicated himself to recording every report of police abuse that came his way. Young people like Renan, students from the writing project, friends, and family shared painful experiences, violent searches, intimidation, and racist remarks from officers. The pattern was clear. Police stops in the neighborhood disproportionately targeted black youth. To strengthen the case, Miguel reached out to Amanda Costa, a human rights lawyer who had worked on police brutality cases before. Amanda, a determined and articulate black woman, was outraged by the accounts. Together, they compiled a robust dossier to file complaints with the public prosecutor's office and other authorities. Yet, as the reports piled up, so did the high tension. Police presence in Villa Esperanza grew heavier, and Miguel began noticing suspicious activity near his home. Patrol cars frequently parked on his street, and officers' stares grew more confrontational. One morning, as he left for another project session, he found his door vandalized with offensive words. "Traitor! You'll pay dearly!" Miguel felt a mix of fear and anger, but chose to press on. Silence wasn't an option. The intimidation peaked during a project meeting at the library. Officers barged in, interrupting the class under the pretext of a security check. The tension was palpable. The teenagers were terrified, some on the verge of tears. "Is this necessary? We're just studying. There's no reason for this aggression," Miguel questioned, trying to stay calm. The sergeant leading the group, a middle-aged white man with a hardened expression, looked at him with disdain. We're ensuring this place isn't being used to incite trouble. I know the kind of people who hang around here." Miguel swallowed hard. The message was clear. Stop exposing the system or face the consequences. After the incident, Amanda suggested going to the press, taking the case public to prevent Miguel and the teenagers from being silenced. But Miguel hesitated. He feared putting everyone at risk, especially the youth who trusted him. Things worsened when Renan, the boy who had been unjustly stopped earlier, was detained on suspicion of drug trafficking while walking home from the library. No evidence was found, but he spent hours at the station, intimidated and humiliated. That was the last straw. Miguel decided it was time to act more decisively. He and Amanda organized a press conference at the library, inviting journalists, human rights NGOs, and lawyers. The plan was to publicly present the dossier, using visibility as a shield for the community. Yet, police pressure escalated too. While preparing for the event, Miguel started receiving anonymous calls, veiled threats urging him to drop the complaint. He knew there was no turning back. The fight against police abuse had become a matter of resistance and survival. The Bisatti, day of the press conference, arrived, bringing a mix of apprehension and hope. The Carolina de Jesus Community Library was packed. Journalists, activists, community members, and even some of Miguel's writing students. Amanda alternated between reviewing the dossier and calming the visibly nervous youth. Miguel, standing near the entrance, watched everything intently. He knew the event could have serious consequences, but it was also his best chance to expose the truth and seek justice. He adjusted the makeshift microphone on a simple table as Amanda opened with a firm speech about combating police violence and structural racism. "We're here today to give voice to the silenced, to show that the youth of Villa Esperanza aren't criminals. They're victims of a system that criminalizes them for their appearance," she declared. Miguel took the microphone. His heart raced, but his voice was steady. "For years, I've written about injustice, about the burden of being seen as a threat before being heard. But now, this isn't just text. It's our reality. We're here to denounce and demand respect." As he spoke, a group of officers entered the library. Miguel recognized the sergeant from the hostile encounter weeks earlier. The room grew tense. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the clicking of journalists' cameras. "This is a public event, not a police operation. Are you here to intimidate or to listen?" Miguel challenged, standing his ground. The sergeant smirked. "Just ensuring there are no excesses, Professor." Miguel knew this was a test. One misstep, and they could accuse him of inciting chaos. Determined not to yield to fear, he continued his speech, detailing the abuses documented in the dossier. When finished, he handed the material to the journalists, explaining his intent to file a formal complaint with the public prosecutor's office. The press conference made headlines locally and on social media. Videos of Miguel confronting the sergeant went viral, and public pressure mounted. Days later, the Police Internal Affairs Unit announced an investigation into officer conduct in Villa Esperanza. But the victory came with an unexpected blow. Returning home one night, Miguel found his door broken open. His books, papers, and files were ransacked. The computer storing digital copies of the dossier and sensitive documents was gone. On the living room wall, red graffiti screamed, "Shut up or pay the price." The threat hit hard. The fear was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who trusted him. The next morning, he called Amanda, recounting the incident. She advised him to step back temporarily, but Miguel knew retreating meant surrender. He was at the eye of the storm. He had risked everything to expose the truth, and now faced a brutal choice: protect his life or keep fighting for justice. After the attack on his home, Miguel wrestled with fear and resolve. He knew backing down now would collapse the movement he and Amanda had built with the youth. Yet the threat was real. His safety and that of his loved ones were at stake. That week, Amanda organized an emergency meeting at the library, now under the watchful eyes of the community. NGO members, independent journalists, and human rights lawyers gathered to strategize. Miguel, still shaken, hesitated to speak, but the solidarity of allies gave him strength. If we retreat now, they win. We can't let fear silence us, Amanda declared firmly, but we need better protection and organization. The proposal emerged to form a formal collective, Voices of Hope, to continue denouncing abuses and provide legal support to victims of police violence. The collective would have pro bono lawyers and alternative media backing. Touched by the community's support, Miguel chose not to hide. He joined the collective actively but cautiously. Amanda helped secure his home, while independent journalists widely publicized the attack. Paradoxically, public exposure became a shield. Yet the attacks didn't stop. Renan, the boy unjustly detained earlier, began facing harassment outside project hours. One day, leaving school, he was tailed by a patrol car. Renan's mother called Miguel in despair, saying her son was too scared to walk alone. The situation grew unbearable when Kawa, a journalist who covered the press conference, received death threats. His car was vandalized, and a message on the windshield warned him to stop reporting on Villa Esperanza. The atmosphere was one of terror and fury. Then something unexpected happened. The story went national. TV programs, podcasts, and news portals began covering the police abuses, exposing what had long been ignored. Miguel was invited to interviews, debates, and forums, becoming the leading voice against police violence in the region. During a live interview confronted by a public security official denying any wrongdoing, Miguel remained calm. Denying the facts doesn't erase them. I see the fear in these young people's eyes, kids who should be dreaming but are treated as threats. And we won't stop fighting until that changes. His words reverberated online, mobilizing collectives nationwide. Protests erupted not just in Villa Esperanza, but in marginalized neighborhoods across the country. Miguel's struggle had transcended his community. He knew the risks remained, that the system was still hostile. But his resistance had gained powerful allies. This was no longer his fight alone. It belonged to everyone who refused to stay silent. The growth of the Voices of Hope collective and the national spotlight on police violence turned Villa Esperanza into a symbol of resistance. With support from NGOs, lawyers, and activists nationwide, Miguel became a figurehead for social justice. Public pressure forced the police internal affairs unit to launch a formal investigation. The community celebrated, but Miguel knew this was just one step. Such investigations often dragged on without results, and threats against those who spoke out persisted. That week, a pivotal event was scheduled, a public hearing at the State Legislative Assembly. Community members, lawyers, and victims of police violence would share testimonies before lawmakers and public security officials. Miguel was a keynote speaker alongside Amanda, Renan, and other youth. On the day of the hearing, tension hung thick. Officers lined the building's entrance, many glaring at the collective's members. Amanda tried to calm Renan, who grew anxious at the sight of so many uniforms. Miguel, though focused, felt the weight of responsibility. When his turn came, the auditorium was packed. He took a deep breath and began. I'm Miguel Andrade, retired professor, writer, and resident of Villa Esperanza. For years, I've written about inequality and prejudice, but I never imagined my own community would have to fight just to be seen as human. We're here to say we won't accept being treated as enemies in our own homes. He recounted the violent stops, the unjust criminalization of youth, the attacks on the collective. Amanda followed with legal analysis, highlighting structural racism in policing. When Renan took the mic, his voice shook but held firm. I just wanted to go to class to write. I didn't want to be treated like a criminal because of my skin. His words echoed through the room. The silence was profound. Journalists scribbled notes. Cameras captured every moment. Across the aisle, a public security official, a stern-faced white man, spoke. "We regret any excesses, but aggressive policing is necessary to curb violence in these areas. The innocent have nothing to fear." The phrase was a gut punch. Miguel seized the mic again. "The innocent have nothing to fear, sir. The boys of Villa Esperanza don't fear guilt. They fear their skin color. They don't fear the violence they commit, but the violence they endure. When justice is blind to these differences, it's not justice, it's oppression." The room erupted in applause. The moment went viral, becoming a rallying cry for the collective. Days later, Internal Affairs suspended several officers and announced anti-racism training for the force. Voices of hope grew stronger, backed by artists, progressive politicians, and academics. Miguel knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time he felt his voice, and so many others, had shattered the imposed silence. The days after the hearing were intense for Miguel and the Voices of Hope collective. Miguel's speech and Renan's emotional testimony mobilized other communities, activists, and NGOs. Villa Esperanza, once a marginalized territory, was now a symbol of resistance against systemic racism and abuse of power. Media coverage continued, interviewing residents, teachers, lawyers, and victims. Documentaries were produced, and invitations for lectures and debates poured in from universities and cultural institutions. The collective expanded, offering legal aid and psychological support to victims. Yet Miguel knew the danger hadn't passed. Officers under investigation still patrolled the neighborhood, casting defiant glances. Some collective members faced subtle intimidation, and rumors spread of patrol cars idling outside activists' homes. But retreat was no longer an option. At a collective meeting, Miguel looked at the young faces who had found the courage to speak. Among them, Renan stood taller, actively participating in planning future actions. "The fight doesn't end with a hearing or a news segment. But now we know we're not alone. And that's powerful," Miguel said, met with nods of agreement. The movement reached politics. Lawmakers proposed bills to revise police protocols and combat institutional racism in law enforcement. Public debate on police violence intensified, and activists from other cities sought the collective's guidance. One afternoon, Miguel received a letter from Renan's mother. Her words, filled with gratitude, moved him deeply. "Professor, thank you for believing in our children when so many only see threats. Thank you for showing that fear doesn't have to silence us. May your voice keep echoing for all of us." In that moment, Miguel understood the true impact of his resistance. It wasn't just about him. It was about all those deemed invisible and criminalized by a society quick to label them. Years later, Villa Esperanza was still watched, but now it was also seen. The library's writing project thrived, becoming a space for young authors like Renan to publish powerful works about their experiences. Miguel remained a mentor, but his greatest legacy was the voices he'd helped awaken, voices that would echo long after him. Years after the events in Villa Esperanza, the neighborhood had transformed into a beacon of resistance and community organizing. The once modest library was now a vibrant cultural hub, hosting writing workshops, human rights talks, and events that drew citywide attention. Voices of Hope exceeded expectations, formalizing as an NGO offering legal, psychological, and educational support. It became a national model for combating police violence and promoting racial equality. Other marginalized communities replicated its methods. Miguel, nearing 60, remained a constant presence. His writing evolved from critique to testimony, culminating in his book Echoes of Hope, chronicling the collective's struggles and victories. It became required reading in sociology and human rights courses, inspiring youth across the country. Renan, the once timid boy, was now a journalism student. His articles in progressive outlets exposed police brutality and amplified marginalized voices. each line bearing Miguel's influence, the courage to turn pain into power. At a book launch event, Renan, now a reporter, approached Miguel with a smile. "Professor, remember that day at the library? When we almost gave up? On the press conference?" Miguel laughed, recalling the fear of that time. "I do. And look how far we've come, Renan." The voice they tried to silence now echoes across the country. Leaving the event, walking through Villa Esperanza's streets, Miguel observed the changes. Racist graffiti had been replaced by murals of black youth, raised fists, symbols of resistance. Police presence remained, but now under the watchful eyes of a community ready to denounce abuse. The painful past would never be forgotten, but hope for a different future endured. Miguel knew the struggle had no end, but the certainty that his words, his courage, had planted seeds of change brought him peace. The professor who defied the system to protect Villa Esperanza's youth was now a symbol of courage. His voice, once dismissed, was heard by many. And where silence had once been enforced by fear, there now stood a chorus of unwavering voices, voices that would never be silenced again.